The coffee mug slipped from Elena's trembling fingers, ceramics shattering against the diner's worn linoleum as scalding liquid splashed across her ankles. The pain barely registered through the exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones after another 14-hour shift. Her uniform clung to her skin, stained with grease, and the lingering scent of desperation that seemed to permeate every corner of this segregated section of Chicago. The golden light from the human dining area cast long shadows toward the dimmer vampire section, where empty tables waited in perpetual twilight. Elena knelt to gather the broken pieces, her knees protesting against the cold floor. 3 jobs, 7 days a week, and still the rent notice crumpled in her apron pocket felt like a lead weight against her hip. Her mother's medication costs had doubled again, and her younger brother needed new shoes for school. The arithmetic of survival played endlessly in her mind, each calculation more desperate than the last. She pressed her palms against the floor, steadying herself as dizziness threatened to pull her down into the shards of porcelain. The bell above the entrance chimed, its sound cutting through the late evening quiet like a blade. Elena glanced up from her knees to see a figure stepping through the doorway, moving with the fluid grace that immediately marked her as vampire. The young woman's pale skin seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights, her dark hair falling in waves around a face that held both ethereal beauty and unmistakable loneliness. She wore simple clothes, nothing that would mark her as royalty, but there was something in her bearing that whispered of nobility held under careful restraint. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the other patrons noticed the newcomer. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and eyes turned with the cold calculation that had become commonplace in this divided city. Elena felt her chest tighten as she recognized the look spreading across the faces around her. The vampire girl stood uncertainly in the doorway, her violet eyes scanning the room for a welcoming face that would not come. "Look what just wandered into the wrong neighborhood," came a voice from the corner booth, thick with alcohol and malice. Marcus Wellington, one of the city's prominent real estate developers, pushed back from his table with deliberate slowness. His expensive suit couldn't hide the cruelty that had made him wealthy, buying up properties in vampire districts and converting them to human-only housing. 2 other men in equally expensive attire flanked him, their faces wearing the same predatory expression. The vampire girl's shoulders tensed, but she moved forward anyway, approaching an empty table in the neutral zone between the 2 sections. Her movements were careful, non-threatening, but Elena could see the slight tremor in her hands as she pulled out a chair. The sound of chair legs scraping against linoleum seemed unnaturally loud in the hostile silence. "Excuse me, bloodsucker," Wellington called out, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Can't you read? This is a human establishment." He gestured broadly at the warm lighting, the American flag hanging behind the counter, the photographs of human families that decorated the walls. "Your kind has plenty of places to feed. Find one." Elena's hands clenched around the broken ceramic, sharp edges biting into her palms. She had seen this scene play out before, had watched from behind the counter as customers drove out anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. The management always looked the other way, afraid of losing business from the influential human clientele. Her job depended on staying invisible, on serving coffee and keeping her mouth shut. The vampire girl's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "I'm not here to feed. I just wanted some coffee." The words carried a soft accent, something European that spoke of old-world refinement. "Please, I'll sit in the vampire section if you prefer." Wellington's laugh was sharp and ugly. "You'll sit nowhere, princess. This isn't some charity case where your daddy's money can buy you acceptance." He stepped closer, his companions following like wolves sensing weakness. "We work hard for what we have, and we don't need your kind contaminating our spaces." The girl's face flushed, but whether from anger or embarrassment, Elena couldn't tell. She watched as the young vampire's hands folded carefully in her lap, her spine straightening with a dignity that seemed to come from within rather than from any external validation. There was something heartbreaking about her composure, the way she absorbed the cruelty without striking back. "My name is Valentina," she said quietly, looking directly at Wellington despite the hatred burning in his eyes. "And I'm not asking for charity. Just the same service you'd give anyone else." "Anyone else?" Wellington's voice rose, drawing the attention of every remaining patron. "You're not anyone else, sweetheart. You're a parasite, a leech that feeds off human blood and pretends to be civilized." He leaned over her table, his hands planted on either side of her coffee cup. "Your kind has been taking from us for centuries, and now you want to sit at our tables like you belong here?" Elena felt something crack inside her chest, a sound like ice breaking under pressure. She stood slowly, the ceramic shards falling from her hands to scatter across the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and sweat beaded along her forehead despite the air conditioning. She thought of her mother's gentle hands, the way she had taught Elena to see past surfaces to the person underneath. She thought of her brother's questions about why the world seemed so divided, why kindness had to be rationed based on what someone was, rather than who they were. "That's enough." The words left her mouth before she fully realized she was speaking. The sound of her own voice surprised her, steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and the weight of their attention felt like a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. Wellington straightened, his face twisting with incredulous anger. "Excuse me?" Elena stepped forward, her legs shaking but moving nonetheless. "I said that's enough. She's not bothering anyone. She just wants coffee, same as you." Her voice grew stronger with each word, fed by a fire she hadn't known existed within her. "There's no law against serving someone because they're different from you." The laughter that erupted from Wellington's table was harsh and mocking. "Well, well, looks like our little waitress has opinions." He turned his full attention on Elena, and she felt the force of his contempt like a physical blow. "Tell me, sweetheart, how much are they paying you to defend the bloodsuckers? Or maybe you're hoping to become one yourself?" Heat flooded Elena's cheeks, but she held her ground. Behind Wellington, she could see Valentina watching her with wide eyes, surprise and something that might have been gratitude flickering across her pale features. The other patrons had fallen completely silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding before them. "Nobody's paying me anything," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm defending her because it's the right thing to do. Because she's sitting alone, asking for nothing but basic decency, and you're treating her like garbage for no reason except your own prejudice." Wellington's face darkened, the veins in his forehead standing out like cords. "You have no idea who you're talking to, little girl. I own half the buildings on this block. One phone call from me, and you'll be out of a job before morning." The threat hit Elena like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She thought of her mother's medical bills, her brother's school supplies, the stack of overdue notices hidden in her dresser drawer. Losing this job would mean losing everything, would mean watching her family slide into the kind of poverty that destroyed lives and dreams with equal efficiency. But as she looked at Valentina's face, at the quiet dignity the young vampire maintained despite the hatred surrounding her, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Some fundamental understanding that there were things more important than security, principles that couldn't be compromised without losing something essential about who she was. "Then make your call," Elena said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "But until you do, she's staying. And if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the management. I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about how you're harassing their customers." The silence that followed felt electric, charged with the potential for violence or change. Elena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could smell the fierce sweat that had broken out across her skin. But she didn't move, didn't back down, didn't let the terror show on her face. Just as it seemed Elena's courage would cost her everything, a power far greater than she could imagine was about to step out of the shadows. The silence stretched thin as a wire about to snap. Elena felt the weight of every stare in the room, the collective held breath of witnesses to her defiance. Wellington's face had gone purple with rage, his hands clenched into fists that trembled with barely contained violence. Behind him, his companions exchanged glances that spoke of escalation, of consequences that would extend far beyond this moment. "You stupid, naive little girl," Wellington hissed, stepping closer until Elena could smell the expensive cologne that failed to mask the stench of his cruelty. "You have no idea what you've just done, what you've just thrown away." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "I don't just own buildings, I own people, politicians, police, and by tomorrow morning, you'll discover exactly how small and powerless you really are." Elena's throat felt dry as sand, but she forced herself to swallow, to breathe, to remain standing. She could feel Valentina behind her, could sense the vampire girl's tension like electricity in the air. The other patrons had begun to murmur among themselves, phones appearing in hands as they prepared to document whatever came next. "Maybe I am powerless," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying with absolute clarity. "Maybe you can destroy my life with a phone call. But that doesn't make what you're doing right. And somebody has to say that. Somebody has to stand up." Wellington's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Stand up? You're about to fall so hard you'll never get back up. Your mother's medication, isn't it? Diabetes, from what I hear. Expensive condition. And your little brother, what's he, 14? Lots of schools in this city, but not many that will take a kid whose sister made enemies of the wrong people." The blood drained from Elena's face as the true scope of Wellington's reach became clear. He had done his research, had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a predator who never left anything to chance. Around the room, she could see the other patrons beginning to recognize the players in this drama, the way power and influence flowed through the city's hidden channels. But before Elena could respond, before Wellington could deliver whatever final blow he had prepared, a shadow detached itself from the darkest corner of the restaurant. The figure that emerged from the vampire section moved with a silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. Tall and imposing, dressed in a simple dark suit that somehow conveyed more authority than Wellington's flashy attire ever could, he stepped into the light with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. His presence changed the very atmosphere of the room, as if the air itself had grown thicker, more charged with potential energy. The temperature dropped noticeably as he approached, and Elena felt the hair on her arms rise in response to something primal, something that recognized predator from prey without conscious thought. This was not merely a vampire. This was something far more dangerous, far more powerful than anything she had ever encountered. Wellington's voice died in his throat as he turned to face the newcomer. The color drained from his face with remarkable speed, leaving him pale as parchment. His companions took automatic steps backward, their earlier bravado evaporating like mist in sunlight. "Your Majesty," Wellington stammered, the words falling from his lips like stones. We didn't know. We weren't aware." The vampire king said nothing at first, his dark eyes taking in the scene with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to judging both crimes and character. His gaze moved from Wellington to his cowering companions, to the watching crowd of patrons, before finally settling on Elena with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected. When King Alejandro Dracul finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Aware of what, Mr. Wellington? That my daughter chose to visit this establishment? that she sought nothing more than a cup of coffee and the basic courtesy that should be extended to any patron. Elena's breath caught in her throat as understanding crashed over her like a wave. Valentina, the lonely young woman she had defended, the vulnerable girl who had asked only for dignity, was the vampire princess, the daughter of the most powerful supernatural being in the city, perhaps in the entire region. Wellington's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his earlier eloquence deserting him completely. Around the room, phones were being hastily lowered, their owners suddenly realizing they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple restaurant confrontation. Or perhaps, the king continued, his tone growing colder with each word, you weren't aware that threatening the livelihood of an innocent woman for the crime of showing compassion makes you exactly the kind of parasite you claim to despise? The word parasite hung in the air like a blade, thrown back at Wellington with surgical precision. Elena watched as the real estate mogul seemed to shrink before her eyes, his expensive suit and cultivated arrogance offering no protection against the quiet fury of true power. King Alejandro stepped closer to Wellington, close enough that the human could undoubtedly feel the supernatural chill that emanated from the vampire's skin. You spoke of ownership, Mr. Wellington, of buildings and influence, and the ability to destroy lives with a phone call. Tell me, how many of those buildings were purchased with money borrowed from vampire financial institutions? How many of your political connections depend on the supernatural community's continued tolerance of your existence? Wellington's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of ash after a fire has consumed everything valuable. Elena could see understanding dawning in his eyes, the realization that his power had always been contingent, borrowed, dependent on the goodwill of forces he had chosen to antagonize. Your Majesty, please, Wellington began, but the king silenced him with a raised hand. I have spent the better part of an hour observing this establishment, Alejandro said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Watching the interactions, listening to the conversations, trying to understand how my people are treated when they venture into supposedly neutral spaces. His eyes swept the room, taking in every face, every witness to this moment. What I have seen disappoints me greatly. Elena felt her knees threatening to give way beneath her. The magnitude of what she had stumbled into, the forces she had unknowingly challenged, seemed to press down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She had defended a princess, had stood between the vampire royal family and public humiliation, had risked everything for someone whose true identity she had never suspected. But as these thoughts raced through her mind, she found her gaze drawn to Valentina, who was watching her with an expression of wonder and gratitude that transcended social boundaries. In that moment, Elena realized that it didn't matter who Valentina was, what title she carried, what power flowed through her bloodline. She was still the lonely young woman who had asked for nothing more than coffee and courtesy. The act of defending her had been right regardless of the consequences. King Alejandro seemed to sense this realization, his dark eyes studying Elena with newfound interest. You knew none of this when you chose to intervene, he said, and it wasn't a question. You saw only someone being mistreated and decided to act. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The king stepped closer, and she caught a hint of something ancient in his scent, something that spoke of centuries and power and responsibilities she could barely comprehend. What is your name? He asked. Elena Martinez, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena Martinez, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. You work here? Support your family with your wages? Again, she nodded, acutely aware of her stained uniform, her worn shoes, the gap between her world and his that seemed vast as an ocean. King Alejandro turned back to Wellington, who had remained frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. You threaten this woman's livelihood, spoke of destroying her family's security because she showed compassion to someone you deemed unworthy of it. The temperature around them seemed to drop another degree. You will rectify this immediately. Rectify? Wellington's voice cracked on the word. You will ensure that Miss Martinez faces no professional consequences for her actions tonight. You will use whatever influence you claim to possess to guarantee her continued employment and her family's security. The king's smile was sharp as a blade. Consider it an investment in your own continued prosperity. Wellington nodded frantically, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. Of course, Your Majesty, absolutely. There will be no problems, no consequences. But King Alejandro wasn't finished. He turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying with the resonance of formal proclamation. Let it be known that Elena Martinez has this night demonstrated the kind of character that transcends species, class, and circumstance. She has shown courage when it would have been easier to remain silent. Compassion when cruelty was the expected response. Dignity in the face of threats and intimidation. Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs as every eye in the room focused on her. This felt like a dream, like some impossible scenario that existed only in stories and fantasies. But the king's next words shattered any illusion that this was anything other than reality. For these reasons, and in recognition of her demonstrated integrity, I hereby appoint Elena Martinez as Special Ambassador for Human-Vampire Relations, with all the rights, protections, and responsibilities that such a position entails. His voice grew stronger, more formal. She will serve as liaison between our communities, working to bridge the divide that has for too long separated our peoples. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Elena stared at the king, certain she had misheard, that exhaustion and stress had finally caused her mind to snap completely. Ambassador? Her? A waitress who could barely make rent, who had never traveled beyond the city limits, who knew nothing of diplomacy or politics or the complex dynamics between species? But King Alejandro's expression was entirely serious, his dark eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. The position comes with a substantial salary, naturally, health benefits for your entire family, education opportunities, housing allowances. He paused, seeming to consider something. I believe the compensation is approximately 50 times what you currently earn. Elena's legs gave out completely, and she found herself sitting hard on the floor, her back against the counter. The numbers he had mentioned seemed impossible, meaningless in their magnitude. 50 times her current salary would mean her mother could have the best medical care available. Her brother could attend any school he chose. The crushing weight of financial desperation that had defined her entire adult life would simply disappear. But why? She whispered, the words barely audible. I'm nobody special. I don't know anything about diplomacy or politics or... King Alejandro knelt beside her, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, she could see that his eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of experience, of decisions that had shaped the fate of thousands. But there was also something else there, something that looked remarkably like respect. You are wrong about being nobody special, he said quietly. Tonight, when faced with threats and intimidation, you chose to do what was right rather than what was safe. You saw past species and circumstance to recognize fundamental dignity. These are not common qualities, Miss Martinez. They are, in fact, exceptionally rare. Around them, the restaurant had erupted into whispered conversations, phones reappearing as people began to grasp the historical significance of what they were witnessing. The first human vampire ambassador in the city's history, chosen not from the ranks of politicians or diplomats, but from a simple waitress who had shown unexpected courage. Wellington and his companions had begun edging toward the exit, clearly hoping to escape before the king's attention returned to them. But Alejandro's voice stopped them cold. "Gentlemen," the word carried enough ice to freeze blood. "Before you leave, I believe you owe someone an apology." They turned slowly, reluctantly, their earlier arrogance replaced by the desperate calculation of men trying to salvage whatever they could from complete disaster. "Miss Martinez," Wellington said, his voice hollow, we apologize for our behavior tonight. It was inappropriate and uncalled for." Elena looked up at him from her position on the floor, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Without his bluster and intimidation, he seemed smaller, more pathetic. A man whose power had always depended on others choosing not to challenge it. But as she prepared to accept his apology, Elena felt something unexpected rise within her chest. Not hatred or triumph, but something that surprised her with its intensity. Pity. This man who had threatened her family, who had tried to destroy her life over an act of simple kindness, was revealed now as fundamentally small. His cruelty had been born not from strength, but from weakness, from a desperate need to feel superior to someone, anyone. "And my daughter?" King Alejandro prompted, his tone making it clear this was not a suggestion. Wellington turned to Valentina, who had remained seated throughout the entire confrontation, watching events unfold with wide eyes. "Princess Valentina, I apologize for my disrespect. For my words and actions. They were—" He swallowed hard. "Unbecoming." Valentina nodded graciously, her response carrying more dignity than Elena had ever seen in someone so young. "Your apology is accepted, Mr. Wellington. I hope you'll find more peace in your heart going forward." The kindness in her words, the genuine forgiveness offered to someone who had shown her such cruelty, struck Elena like a physical blow. This was nobility in its truest sense, not the accident of birth or the accumulation of wealth, but the choice to respond to hatred with grace. As Wellington and his companions finally escaped into the night, King Alejandro turned his attention back to Elena. "The position I've offered you is not merely ceremonial," he said. "There is real work to be done, important bridges to build between our communities. It will not always be easy, and there will be those on both sides who resist change." Elena forced herself to stand, her legs still shaking but holding her weight. "I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that. I've never been an ambassador before. I don't know the first thing about—" "You know the most important thing," the king interrupted. "You know how to see people as individuals rather than representatives of their species. You know how to choose principle over convenience. These skills are far rarer than you might imagine." Around them, the normal sounds of the restaurant were beginning to return as the other patrons processed what they had witnessed. Elena could hear fragments of conversations, people already beginning to call friends and family to share the incredible story they had just seen unfold. But her attention was drawn to Valentina, who had stood and was walking toward them with the same fluid grace that had marked her earlier entrance. Up close, Elena could see that the princess's eyes were bright with unshed tears, though whether from gratitude or relief, she couldn't tell. "Thank you," Valentina said simply, the words carrying more weight than any elaborate speech could have managed. "What you did tonight, no one has ever—" She paused, seeming to struggle for the right words. "No one has ever defended me like that, just because it was right." Elena felt her own eyes beginning to burn with emotion. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," she said. "Doesn't matter who they are or where they come from." King Alejandro watched this exchange with an expression that might have been approval. "This is exactly why you are the right person for this position," he said. "Change begins with individuals choosing to act on their principles. What you did tonight will be remembered as the moment when the tide began to turn." The next hour passed in a blur of practical arrangements. Phone numbers were exchanged, meeting times established, Legal documents discussed. Elena learned that her new position would come with an office in the downtown government building, a staff of assistants, and resources she had never dreamed of having access to. The king explained that her primary responsibility would be facilitating communication between human and vampire communities, working to address misunderstandings and conflicts before they escalated into confrontations. But perhaps most importantly, she learned that she would not be facing these challenges alone. Valentina, it turned out, had been advocating for improved human-vampire relations for years, working behind the scenes to promote understanding and cooperation. The two of them would form the core of a new initiative aimed at breaking down the barriers that had divided the city for generations. As the evening wound down and the restaurant finally began to empty, Elena found herself standing outside in the cool night air, still trying to process everything that had changed in the span of a few hours. King Alejandro had departed in a sleek black car that had appeared as if from nowhere, leaving behind only the lingering scent of power and possibility. Valentina remained, however, seemingly in no hurry to leave. The two women stood together on the sidewalk, an unlikely pair brought together by circumstances neither could have anticipated. "Are you nervous?" Valentina asked, her voice soft in the darkness. Elena considered the question seriously. "Terrified," she admitted. "But also excited. I've never had the chance to make a real difference before, to be part of something bigger than just surviving day to day." Valentina smiled, and in the glow of the streetlight, Elena could see that her earlier vulnerability had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. "I think we're going to do great things together," she said. "My father doesn't make decisions lightly. If he chose you for this position, it's because he saw something special in you." As Elena walked home that night, her mind racing with plans and possibilities, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had been divided into two distinct parts, before and after this moment. The woman who had started her shift as a struggling waitress, worried about rent and medical bills and the grinding reality of financial desperation, no longer existed. Her life as a waitress was over, but her new life, a life she had earned not with wealth or power, but with a single act of courage, was just beginning. The early morning light filtering through the windows of Elena's new office still felt surreal after 3 months in her role as Special Ambassador for Human Vampire Relations. The downtown government building hummed with activity around her, but she found herself drawn to the large windows that overlooked the city she was helping to transform. Below, she could see humans and vampires sharing the same sidewalks, the same coffee shops, the same spaces that had once been rigidly segregated. Her assistant knocked softly before entering. "Ambassador Martinez, the Wellington case files are ready for your review, and Princess Valentina is here for your afternoon meeting." Elena turned from the window, still adjusting to the formal title that felt both foreign and empowering. The Wellington case had become symbolic of the broader changes sweeping through Chicago. The real estate mogul had been forced to divest from several properties after investigations revealed discriminatory lending practices, his empire crumbling under the weight of his own prejudice. But today's meeting with Valentina wasn't about punishment. It was about something far more important. Valentina entered with the same grace Elena remembered from that first night. But now her bearing spoke of confidence rather than vulnerability. The months of working together had transformed them both, creating a partnership that transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. "The community center proposal has been approved," Valentina announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "Full funding, city permits, everything we asked for." Elena felt a surge of pride wash over her. The Integrated Community Center would be the first of its kind in Chicago, a space designed specifically to bring humans and vampires together for educational programs, cultural events, and simple social interaction. It represented everything they had been working toward. Where? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. 3 blocks from the diner where we first met, Valentina confirmed with a smile. The irony seemed appropriate. They spent the next hour reviewing plans, discussing programming, and coordinating with the construction teams. But as their official meeting wound down, Elena found herself thinking about the personal cost of her transformation. Her old life had indeed vanished completely. The financial desperation that had once defined her existence felt like a distant memory, replaced by security and purpose she had never imagined possible. Her mother's medical treatments had stabilized her condition completely. Her brother was thriving at a prestigious private school, his natural intelligence finally given proper nurture. The cramped apartment with its stack of overdue bills had been replaced by a comfortable home in a neighborhood where humans and vampires lived as neighbors rather than adversaries. But success had brought its own challenges. Elena had discovered that bridging communities required constant vigilance, endless patience, and the ability to absorb hatred from both sides without letting it poison her own heart. There were humans who viewed her as a traitor to her species, and vampires who questioned whether any human could truly represent their interests. "You're thinking about the protesters again," Valentina observed, reading Elena's expression with the intuition that had developed between them over months of collaboration. Elena nodded. Just last week, a group of human supremacists had gathered outside the government building, holding signs that accused her of selling out humanity for vampire gold. Their words had cut deeper than she expected. Reopening wounds she thought had healed. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm naive to think this can really work," Elena admitted. "Maybe some divisions are too deep to bridge." Valentina was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "Do you remember what you told those men that night at the diner, when they threatened to destroy your life?" Elena thought back to that moment when everything had changed. "I said somebody had to stand up, that somebody had to say it was wrong." "Exactly. And look what that moment of courage created." Valentina gestured toward the window, where the integrated city spread out below them. "Change is never easy, Elena, but it starts with individuals choosing to act on their principles, even when the cost seems too high." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elena's assistant entered again, this time with a look of concern on her face. "Ambassador, there's a situation developing at the community center construction site. Tensions between some of the human and vampire workers. The site supervisor is requesting your immediate presence." Elena felt her stomach tighten. These workplace conflicts had become increasingly common as integration efforts accelerated. Old prejudices died hard, and the construction site brought together people from both communities who had never been forced to work closely together before. The drive to the construction site took them through neighborhoods that bore the visible signs of the city's transformation. Mixed-species businesses lined streets that had once been strictly segregated. Children played in parks where human and vampire families picnicked side by side. But Elena also noticed the subtle signs of resistance, the human-only establishments that still refused to serve vampires, the vampire enclaves that remained closed to human visitors. At the construction site, they found 2 groups squared off against each other, the tension thick enough to cut. The human workers clustered around their foreman, faces hard with suspicion and long-held resentments. The vampire construction crew stood apart, their supernatural stillness making them appear even more alien to their human counterparts. Elena stepped between the groups, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This was the reality of her position, not the ceremonial appearances or policy meetings, but these moments when the careful facade of cooperation threatened to crumble into open hostility. "What happened here?" she asked, directing her question to both groups equally. The human foreman stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "They're working at inhuman speeds, making the rest of us look bad, and they don't need the same safety equipment, so they're cutting corners, creating hazards for everyone else." A vampire worker responded with barely controlled frustration. We're following all posted safety regulations. The fact that we don't require hard hats or safety harnesses doesn't mean we're creating hazards. We're simply using our natural abilities to work efficiently. Elena could see both sides of the conflict clearly. The human workers felt threatened by supernatural abilities that made their own limitations obvious. The vampire workers felt constrained by safety requirements designed for mortal physiology. It was exactly the kind of misunderstanding that could escalate into something far more serious. I understand the concerns on both sides, Elena said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to project over months of similar situations. But we're all working toward the same goal here. This community center represents hope for the future of this city. We can't let old prejudices sabotage that vision. She spent the next hour mediating between the groups, establishing new protocols that accommodated both human safety requirements and vampire capabilities. It was delicate work, requiring her to acknowledge legitimate concerns while firmly shutting down attempts to resurrect ancient grievances. But as the tension began to ease and the workers returned to their tasks, Elena noticed something that made her chest tighten with emotion. One of the human workers, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and tired eyes, approached one of the vampire workers who had been struggling to position a heavy beam without using his supernatural strength. "Here, let me help you with that," the human said, moving to support the other end of the beam. "These regulations are stupid, but we all got to follow them, right?" The vampire worker looked surprised for a moment, then smiled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. I appreciate it." It was a small moment, lasting perhaps 30 seconds, but Elena felt it resonate through her entire being. This was why her position mattered. Not for the grand proclamations or policy changes, but for these individual moments when people chose to see past their differences and extend basic human kindness to one another. As she and Valentina drove back toward downtown, Elena found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. The terrified waitress who had once struggled to pay rent seemed like a different person entirely, someone she had known in another lifetime. "You've been quiet," Valentina observed. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Elena replied. "Sometimes I look back at that night in the diner and wonder what would have happened if I'd just kept my mouth shut. If I'd chosen safety over principle." Valentina was quiet for a moment, then spoke with unusual intensity. "You want to know something I've never told you? My father didn't just happen to be dining in that restaurant that night. He'd been following reports of discrimination against our people, and he'd chosen that particular establishment because of its reputation for hostility toward vampires." Elena felt her breath catch. He was there intentionally? He was conducting his own investigation, trying to understand the depth of the prejudice we faced, but what he found instead was you. Valentina's voice softened. "He told me later that in all his centuries of existence, he had rarely witnessed such pure moral courage. You had everything to lose and nothing to gain, and you chose to act anyway." The weight of this revelation settled over Elena like a blanket. Her life-changing moment hadn't been a random accident, but part of a larger design she had never suspected. Yet somehow, this knowledge didn't diminish the significance of her choice. If anything, it reinforced the importance of individual actions in the face of systemic injustice. They arrived back at the government building as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elena's assistant met them in the lobby with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Ambassador, you need to see the evening news. Channel 7 is running a special report on the community center project." In Elena's office, they gathered around the television to watch a comprehensive piece about the integrated construction project. The reporter interviewed workers from both communities, showing them collaborating on tasks that would have been impossible just months earlier. The segment concluded with footage of human and vampire children playing together in a nearby park, their laughter providing a soundtrack of hope for the future. But it was the final interview that brought tears to Elena's eyes. Marcus Wellington, the man who had once threatened to destroy her life, stood outside his former corporate headquarters, which had been converted into affordable housing for mixed-species families. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice devoid of his former arrogance. "I let fear and prejudice blind me to the humanity in others." What Ambassador Martinez did that night. She showed me what real strength looks like, and I've been trying to live up to that example ever since. Elena stared at the screen, hardly believing what she was seeing. The man who had embodied everything cruel and divisive about the old system was now advocating for integration and cooperation. When the segment ended, she found herself wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Elena," Valentina said softly, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something my father wanted me to share when the time was right." Elena turned to her friend and partner, sensing the gravity in her tone. "That night at the diner, when those men were threatening me, you weren't the only one watching from the human section. There was a little girl there with her parents, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She saw everything that happened, saw you stand up for me when no one else would." Valentina paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. Yesterday, that little girl, who's now 8, brought her vampire classmate to show and tell at school. She told the entire class about the night. She watched a waitress teach her what courage looked like, about how one person's choice to do what was right changed everything. Elena felt something break open in her chest, a flood of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The ripple effects of that single moment of choice had spread farther than she had ever imagined, touching lives she would never know, inspiring actions she would never witness. But as she stood there, surrounded by the tangible evidence of the changes she had helped create, Elena realized that the most important transformation had been within herself. The frightened woman who had once defined herself by her limitations had been replaced by someone who understood the true power of moral courage. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant entered with a final message for the day. "Ambassador, there's a young woman downstairs who says she's starting a human-vampire friendship club at her high school. She wanted to thank you personally for inspiring her to bring different communities together." Elena smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with purpose. "Send her up," she said. "I'd like to meet her." As they waited for their visitor, Elena stood once more at the window overlooking the city. The lights were beginning to come on as darkness fell, and she could see humans and vampires moving through the streets together, sharing the same spaces, the same dreams, the same hopes for the future. The scared waitress who had once struggled to make ends meet was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that true nobility wasn't inherited or purchased, but earned through the countless small choices to choose compassion over cruelty, courage over comfort, hope over fear. In that moment, watching the city she had helped transform, Elena finally understood the full meaning of the journey that had begun with a single act of defiance. She had not just defended a lonely young woman in a restaurant. She had defended the possibility of a better world, one person, one choice, one moment of courage at a time. The future stretched out before her, full of challenges and obstacles and moments when the easy choice would be to remain silent. But Elena knew now that silence in the face of injustice was not an option, not for her, not anymore. She had found her voice, her purpose, her place in the larger story of human and vampire existence. And she would spend every day of her remaining life ensuring that others found theirs as well.